And in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there is this idea that well, you see it in the first and second Maccabees, you see it in Daniel. I guess it's more in the Second Temple period when the Jews are in exile. They're in the Babylonian exile and they're under pagan lords and they're
Hmm.
suffering. That there are priests and prophets and holy people who do penance and make atonement for the people of Israel. And these weren't the people who were bowing down before the Baals and the Ashtoreth poles and all that. These are the people who tried to live the law. Of course, none of us are perfect. We all are sinners. But
Right.
there's this idea that even if you didn't do it,
Hmm.
because you're attached to the people of God, it's part of your responsibility. Like my
Hmm.
kids, my kids, Father Hollowell, because you've been on pilgrimage with them. And, we had some people coming over for Mass yesterday, and there's all these toys and junk and trash in the backyard. And I said, let's get this cleaned up. We'll make it look nice. And one of the kids said, well, I didn't do that. I said, yeah, but you're part of this family. This is your house, you know? And that's kind of the
Yeah.
same thing. Like, you and I didn't do this to the victims, but this is our family.
Right.
We
Right.
need to act and we need to clean it up somehow.
Right. And I know, like, so we went into Exodus 90, kind of then last year, and I took it all on. Everything that I did on that was for victim survivors of abuse. I'd make that prayer before every cold shower, um, and everything else. There's a sense in which, I mean, for us on a human level, like I think we want to do something. Like we want to be in solidarity with each other, with people that are hurting, with people that are suffering. Because when you express a willingness to, like, I know, like I know it's not me, like I didn't do it, but I want to be in solidarity with you who are hurting. I mean, that just adds an infinite level of credibility
Mm-hmm.
to your otherwise. I mean, you can say, "Look, I'm sorry," and that's a good start. To express sorrow for things and to say that my heart breaks for you. But when you literally kind of sit in the ashes with them, and say, "I want to suffer with you," there is an added credibility to that, that I think is important, and typically helps people. I think, in it, well, I know we'll probably get into some other things about it later, but there's also a lot of misunderstandings about it that I think this, is good to talk about and unpack what we mean by this theology of kind of suffering for other people. Some people don't understand it, and there's a lot of misconceptions about it too. I think there's a great video, a great image of it is in the Passion of the Christ for me. It's not strictly a scriptural scene, but I think Mel Gibson, is onto something here where Christ first gets his cross and someone he kisses it,
Mm.
and a guy in the crowd is just screaming at him, "You're a fool! Why are you kissing your cross?" And I think that's what, but that I think Christ embracing that cross and like, because I know this is going to bring about and help other people.
Mm.
Makes it easier for us to do it, even though some people are still screaming at you, saying like, "Why in the world would you ever do this? This is so stupid. This doesn't make any sense. Uh, your God is, you have some messed up vision of God and all those kind of things." It's like, well, Jesus did it too, and so yeah.
I've been a Protestant, and that is one of the things that turns on light bulbs or fireworks go off in your mind as you're learning what Catholicism is and the riches of Catholicism. And it's a little bit of a scandal, but then also just a huge, um, glorious doctrine that we have this idea of vicarious suffering. And in the Mass, there's prayers that the priests say that are in the collects, but also in the Roman canon. That by the suffering and the merits of saints in
Hmm.
Christ. I mean, all this happens within the person of Christ in his church. But the idea that somehow Saint Agatha's suffering and her good deeds not only helped the church back then, but continue to reverberate through the church. Every time the Roman canon is cited, or Saint Agnes, or Saint John the Baptist, or any of these saints, especially in their martyrdoms. The saints, the canonizations was originally martyrs, and this idea that somehow their credit, their merit, could be beneficial to us sinners still here on earth.
Hmm.
That's Luther hated that.
Right.
Protestants reject that. They don't like it. It's Christ alone. But in Catholic theology, we have room for that. And
Right.
so I think you, as a Catholic priest, reading the Pennsylvania report, feeling the enormous load of sorrow that these people experience from the hands of priests, you in that tradition, that great Catholic tradition, said, I want to do something. I'm offering myself to suffer with them and for them even.
Right. And isn't, I mean, right? Like there's so much that's so good about powerful about suffering and Catholicism and making the faith. I think where it helps distinguish Catholicism from the 40,000 other Christianity formats that are out there. Does Christ suffer? Is that enough for the sanctification and redemption of the world? Well, yes. But does Christ's love also enough for the sanctification and redemption of the world? Well, yeah, in one sense, but we're still called to love.
Right.
Like we can participate. For Catholics, there's this sense in which we participate in the breaking forth of the kingdom into the world now, and we have a role to play in that. Is Christ's cross enough? Does it win salvation? Yes, but do we have a role to play in bringing that forth into the world? Yes. Why are we here? Why?
Right.
Why?
Why not just
Like,
we get baptized, poof, you go to heaven? Yeah,
right,
there's something
right.
to be
Like,
done.
there's love. So everyone admits that, like, I have to love, right? So, but isn't Christ's love enough? Yes, it is. But am I supposed to still love? Yes, because I'm called to participate in it. And it's the same with suffering. Our suffering never has to be meaningless.
Mm,
It and so for me, one of the places that I see as a pastor suffering breaking out the worst is in nursing homes.
mm,
Okay. I go to nursing homes and it's everybody staring at the wall, broken people, spiritually crushed because they've been abandoned and many times by their families, right? Going into places like that, going into the hospitals, going into the people who have no one else, to tell them your suffering can be transformative and offered up for other people instantly changes the dynamic for them. Whereas the Protestant message, a lot of the time, is if you're suffering, like that stinks. Like that, I mean, like,
yeah.
I'm not saying it's always even the prosperity gospel. It's certainly they're going to tell you that, God hates you if you're suffering. But then a lot of times I just hear from Protestantism sort of indifference to suffering. Like I don't know if it happens,
They
like,
don't have a category or a theology for it. So it's just
no,
sort of they can't put it into their Lego creation. So those bricks just sort of sit off to the side and they never get incorporated. Whereas you know ours, we have the crucifix. I mean, if you go to a mega church, they don't even, not only they don't have crucifixes, they don't even have crosses
right,
because that's uncomfortable. Seeing
right,
Christ bloody on a cross, crown of thorns, wearing a loincloth, that's
right,
uncomfortable.
right.
But yet, if you understand it and you accept it, it brings you comfort, and that's what you're saying.
Right. And we're called to participate in the cross, right? Like people are always like, "Don't you know about Easter Sunday?" We're like, "Yeah, we know about Easter Sunday, but I haven't resurrected yet."
Right.
Right? Like, so I know Christ is resurrected and then the victory is already won and I'm asked to participate in it, but I'm still not resurrected. Like I still have suffering, right? And so I have a crucifix in every room of my house because I'm suffering, right? Like
Right.
that's why we do it as Catholics. We know about Easter Sunday, and that's part of why we love the crucifix. It's because we know when I look at a crucifix that the suffering and the resurrection are tied together
Yes.
and it's all one piece. So I'm just really super thankful. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that I think it's a great area for us to distinguish ourselves from other types of Christianity that are out there, where there's a lot of times there can be overlap. I think in suffering we stand out and we have a completely different message than a lot of our other Christian brothers and sisters. And what an important thing to have a different message on. because most 25,000 children starve to death today.
Yeah.
Um, and so if you don't know what to do in the face of suffering, then I really don't have any interest in hearing what the rest of your worldview or Christianity says either. Let's start with the hard stuff. And if you have something good to say about the hard stuff, then I'm interested. Then okay, I'm willing to sit down and talk and hear what else you have to say. But if you're just going to tell me like, if you end up in a nursing home or you starve to death today or you have cancer, we don't really know what to tell you. Then I would be like, I'm done. I'm going to move on.
Yeah. 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 Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, Jesus died on the cross. Isn't that enough? And like you said, it is. I mean, it establishes redemption and atonement. It is an infinite sacrifice that Christ makes. But then Christ says to us, take up your cross and follow me. So apparently, there's not just the cross of Jesus. The cross of Jesus creates millions of other crosses. And then he says, by my strength and power and grace, take up your cross. So it is complicated because the idea of our cross participates in his cross. And Protestants have a really hard time of understanding participation of lower elements in the higher element of Christ. That's where they break off.
Mhm.
They see
Right.
Mary and Jesus as competing, whereas everything Mary does is in Christ. Everything the
Hmm.
priest does is in Christ, etc. So, but
Hmm.
somehow you have to be able to say, yes, Christ died on the cross and that was enough. And then because of that, he says to the baptized, now you take up your cross and follow me,
Right.
which presumes you're going to get crucified.
Right. And as Christ's sacrifice, right, lends credibility to his teaching and his witness, it's the same with us. Like I think that it and I mean, as we know, it breaks open spiritual wisdom in our lives. When we suffer, that's what all of Lent is about, taking on suffering, knowing that when I enter into the suffering of Lent, these little small things, that I'm going to achieve new insight into the life of God. It's why he calls us into the desert. It's why he calls us into suffering at times and says, blessed are those who mourn. I mean, there's all these things where Christ is saying, like, there's something about suffering that makes you closer to him. And he's not joking. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's not a metaphor. Um, and yeah, so like, yeah, that to me it's a really important, it's the front edge of ecumenism. I mean, when we talk about, I think, our relation to other faiths, it's okay, well, tell me, let's hash out before we start talking about, other things. Let's talk about suffering and tell me what you think.
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely in the passion narratives that Christ is sinless and he's suffering for the sinners. But another thing that we have as Catholics and Protestants also miss is Our Lady. And you mentioned the
Hmm.
Passion of the Christ, and you see Christ going into the Passion, and then you see the compassion of Our Lady. We believe Our Lady was immaculately conceived. She never committed a venial sin, a mortal sin, lacking concupiscence. And look at how extreme her suffering was. And we
Right,
believe that her suffering and her merits assist and aid and lift us up
right,
now in
right,
2020.
right,
So it's it's right there at the very beginning in the font of Catholicism that if you want to be close to Jesus, his thorns are going to prick you.
right. But there's a blessing in it, right, too, right? Of course, that entering into the suffering is going to strip away the stuff that distracts you. It brings you closer to reality. It doesn't that all the things that are of the world, the comforts and stuff that are not even wrong or evil in themselves, it insulate us from reality. Whereas suffering immediately forces us to ask the really important questions. Why am I here? Why is this happening? Who is God? What is the point of life? It throws to the very front of our minds and our hearts and our souls immediately, suffering does, these super important questions, which is why we have this process and practice of taking them on. If you say that suffering is random and isn't good, then don't do Lent. It's like you hear it a lot of times from other Protestants and stuff that, this sort of rambling or not coherent theology of suffering, but they do Lent. It's like, why? You're like, why? For Catholics, it makes a lot of sense. Like, we're trying to get to reality, and we believe that my suffering changes me and makes me a better person and can draw me closer to God if I allow it and do it the right way.
When you receive ashes on your head, in a way, you are saying, whether you're saying it explicitly, but you are saying implicitly, Lord, I am willing to suffer. I am
Right?
enrolling as a penitent.
There's really no sugarcoating Ash Wednesday. I mean, there's no positive spin on it. I mean, in the sense of secular spin on it at this point. It's just, I think it's this thing that speaks to people. And I mean, that's the thing. I mean, if you're suffering and you think that that suffering is meaningless, that's the most depressing thing that you could possibly experience on earth. But if you flip it to the Catholic understanding of it, which is that suffering actually has great meaning for others, for yourself, it will give you great joy if you just change the way you understand it. It becomes from the worst thing on earth to the best thing. Right? Like, that's the amazing thing about it. So if you're out there peddling this notion of suffering that's not Catholic, you're selling people the worst possible experience on the planet. And the Catholic Church is trying to help people understand and elevate it to know, actually, what you think is the worst experience is actually the most transformative and powerful, life-giving experience that you can have on this side of heaven.